everybody, this is B. Clay Moore, and welcome to The Comic Book Writer. One of the questions I get asked a lot is, what inspires you, or where do your ideas come from, or how did you come up with an idea for a book? So today what I thought I'd do is briefly run down the creation of a book that I did about 12 years ago for Image Comics with Jeremy Haun, and that book was called Battle Hymn. So today I just want to briefly cover the origin of Battle Hymn. So this goes all the way back to when I was in college in the 90s. I was part of an amateur press alliance, which is basically a loose collection of fans creating fanzines for one another, collating them, and then sending them out to each other. And one of the things that I would do when I was a member of this APA, which was called Legends, is create my own characters or draw or write stories about characters I'd created. And one of those characters was called the Midnight Hour, which was, frankly, sort of loosely based on a combination of DC's Hourman and Dr. Midnight. Was intended to be a Golden Age character, and really never had much intention of doing anything other than just playing around with the character in the APA. Well, along the way, the character became kind of the thing I played with the most, and I had other people do versions of the character, draw pictures of it, what have you. I also sort of created, actually, once I left, once I got out of college and was working a full-time day job, I would sort of doodle and create these other characters around this character. And I didn't really have a name for the group of them or anything. It was just something I did in my spare time. So fast forward a few years, and I had done Hawaiian Dick, and I think maybe The Expatriate with Jason Latour at Image, and had done some work for hire. And I decided I wanted to do something set in the Golden Age, in the World War II era, which I'd always been a fan of. And the inspiration for the book originally came from the notion of the original Marvel superheroes in the late 30s and early 40s. There was a Submariner, and there was the Human Torch, who were their two kind of key characters, and then Captain America came along. But my thinking was, surely, like the Human Torch in 1939 was basically a flaming android that flew around and caught everything on fire that he touched. And of course, Submariner was this insane, super powerful underwater brat who ran around smashing ships and crushing tanks. And I thought, well, surely if there was a flaming android out there that someone had created, the U.S. government would have been interested in perhaps figuring out how they could duplicate the process, or at least control that flaming android. And the same would have been for this wing-footed lunatic running around hitting things. So really, the whole genesis for Battle Hymn came from thinking, what if there were actual superpowered not heroes, but superpowered beings floating around the world at the dawn of World War II? How would the government go about attracting them, utilizing them, analyzing them, and what have you? That led to thinking about the government creating their own heroes, and also what other sort of minor league, slightly superpowered people might have been around that would have been caught up in the wake. So from there came the genesis of what ultimately became Battle Hymn. So the first thing I did was I took some of the characters that I had created in the past, which included the Midnight Hour and a character named Johnny Zip, which I thought sounded like a cheesy World War II era super speedster. I took a character that I had created in a book called Love in Tights called Quinn Ray, which was sort of a Submariner doppelganger. In Love in Tights, I had used him in a modern story, sort of a Gift of the Magi story, where the Submariner character Quinn Ray fell in love with this Earth woman superheroine, and it had a twist ending and what have you. But that character existed, and I owned the character since I'd created it, so I dialed them back into the 40s, brought them into the book. The Midnight Hour, I had actually, after Love in Tights started, I actually did a Midnight Hour story with artist Kalman Androsovsky, who had redesigned the character. And again, it was Love in Tights was this romance superhero anthology that Jay Torres and I did, or edited. Lots of people did stories in. And I had done a story, as I said, with Kalman in there, where Kalman had done a pretty cool redesign on the character. I didn't take many elements from those two stories, but I did pull those characters as they existed in that book and brought them into Battle Hymn, what became Battle Hymn. It wasn't Battle Hymn initially. And actually, there was a point when I was going to do more with the Midnight Hour. I had artist Jay Bone had done some sketches and some drawings on another Love and Tight story that we were going to do with the Midnight Hour that we never got around to. So the character had kind of been floating around in the ether for a while. So I took those characters. I created a handful of new characters, and I talked to an artist named Toby Cypress about doing the book with me. And Toby is a freaking genius. I mean, he's a phenomenal artist. He was a phenomenal artist at the time. He did some tweaks on some of these characters, did some design work, did some sample pages, and we called the book Anthem. And I took the book to Image, to Jim Valentino, who was the publisher at the time, and pitched it. And it just kind of stalled at that point for some reason. And eventually, what I realized was that for some reason, Toby's style wasn't really clicking with Jim. And I remember talking to Eric Stevenson about maybe having Toby do some different some character designs or some different samples or what have you. But for my taste, the pages that Toby had done were fantastic. And if they weren't going to work, I didn't want to kind of make a guy as talented and as busy as Toby keep working his butt off to try to get somewhere we might not get. So Toby was like, that's cool, move on. I've got other things I can do. So see if you want to do the book with someone else. Well, right around that time, artist Jeremy Haun and I, who had been friends for a little while, were talking about doing a book that was also set in World War II, loosely inspired by the Blackhawks, which was basically a guerrilla air force fighting, or guerrilla air fighting unit, if you're not familiar with who they were. And we had kicked the idea around a little bit. We had a publisher that had asked us about doing it. And we were on our way down to Dallas for, I want to say, maybe Wizard World Dallas, or I don't know. It was a convention in Dallas. And we drove down there. And, of course, when an artist and a writer are driving a car for a long time, they kick a lot of ideas around. And I was talking about the difficulties I was having with Anthem. And it clicked to both of us that, well, why didn't Jeremy just do the book? We knew that Jim loved Jeremy's work from a book he did at Image called Paradigm. And somewhere between Kansas City and Dallas, it was decided that we would rework the book and the characters and bring Jeremy on board. So Jeremy took the designs for the Midnight Hour and tweaked them to his liking. Basically rebuilt this character, the Artificial Man, from scratch, using his reference and his interests. Redrew Quinn Ray, created from scratch. He and I created the Defender of Liberty and the Proud American, and completely redesigned Johnny Zip. And we pitched the book to Image, and as expected, Jim Valentino did respond to Jeremy's work and approved the 5-issue miniseries. And so we announced the book as Anthem, and immediately ran into trouble when Roy Thomas, who you may or may not be familiar with, but he's a legendary writer and editor, primarily with Marvel Comics from the 60s through the 80s and I guess into the 90s, and he worked for DC as well. Roy was kind of the guy that took the baton from Stan Lee when Stan Lee moved out of comics for the most part. Well, it turned out that Roy had a book that he was publishing in, I want to say, Spain, South America. It was a foreign publisher, but the book was in fact called Anthem. And Roy was a little perplexed and seemed to be under the impression that maybe we had borrowed the title from him, which I promise you we had not. I had never heard of the book before. Rather than argue with a legend, we decided to go ahead and rethink the title. And after kicking it around for a while, came up with, initially it was The Battle Hymn. And in fact, I think it's possible in some of the early, I think the first cover may have a "the" inside the Battle Hymn logo. But we ended up calling it Battle Hymn, and I ran into Roy at a convention not long after that and kind of cleared the air just so he understood that we hadn't swiped the title from him. And so when the book launched, it was in fact called Battle Hymn. Now, it wasn't just Jeremy and I working on the book. The first thing we did was at this point in time, Jeremy hadn't spent a lot of time inking his own work. Nowadays, he inks everything he does, but at the time, he wasn't quite as confident in his inking. So we asked our good friend and fantastic inker, Andy Parks, who at the time was working quite a bit with Phil Hester and has since gone on to not only ink a lot of things, but write a lot of things. So Andy came on board and inked the very first issue. And we had a local colorist who used to work for Hi-Fi Color named Dave Bryant come on and color the book. And Dave is a phenomenal artist in his own right, and he and Jeremy kind of agreed upon a palette that was to Jeremy's liking. And so Dave colored all 5 issues. The logo itself was designed by Brian Fry, who was an artist and graphic designer. And Brian also did some tweaks on the first 3 covers, which Jeremy laid out and drew. And then Brian added color and some design elements to those. The 4th cover was Jeremy and Dave together. And then the 5th cover, we brought Tony Moore in to basically mimic World War II era Marvel Comics covers. And as you can see, he absolutely knocked it out of the park. He perfectly captured the feel of that era. And then he also added this weathering element to the cover, which has become something you see more and more now. But at the time, it was really unusual. So much so that he and I did a tutorial on comic book resources about how it was done. And almost immediately, Eric Larson fell in love with that and did it for one of his covers, and you've seen it more and more since then. But Tony is that kind of thinker. And then we also, just because this is a good example of you're doing a book, you've got a lot of friends in the industry and people whose work you want to support and share. So we also had Mike Norton, Jason Latour, John Rubio, an artist named Elio Guevara. They all did basically flip covers for the book, which if you have single issues, you flip the book over and you can see the covers. And to this day, I still have this original art by Jason Latour from the Battle Hymn cover hanging on my wall, as well as Tony's original art for number 5. And then we had pinups in the book. Nick Dragotta, who has gone on to do quite a few things. Nick and I were discussing at the time the possibility of him coming over to draw Hawaiian Dick. And so Nick contributed a pretty cool pinup. And then Dave Bryant did one. Amber Stone, who's an artist in Joplin. Artist named Greg Giordano also did a pinup and then drew a backup story that I wrote. And finally, Sean Crystal, who has been very successful in recent years, contributed a pretty cool Quinn Ray pinup for us. So in the end, the book was a combination of collaboration between a bunch of sort of up-and-coming professionals who enjoyed working together. And just through circumstance, it was the first thing that Jeremy and I really did together. After that, we did a few other things. We did a book at Oni Press called The Leading Man. We did a G.I. Joe one-shot, Manhattan Mission. I can't remember the name of the title, but it was Special Missions Manhattan is what it was called, which then launched a few more books that Devil's Due was doing related to G.I. Joe. And Jeremy and I also did Bad Karma together, and we're always talking about collaborating on this or that, including someday, we'd hope, a sequel to Battle Hymn. The book over the years has developed sort of a cult following. It did fine when it came out. It was well reviewed. It was reviewed in Entertainment Weekly and actually appeared in a book called The 500 Essential Graphic Novels several years ago, which was flattering to see. And it's, as with any personal projects you do, you'll find that there are people who gravitate towards one thing over other things. And Battle Hymn is one of those books that a lot of people ask me about and ask me if we'll ever see more of it. With that in mind, there was a point a few years ago when I actually did plot, conceive, write, and have drawn the first issue of what would have been sort of a backdoor pilot for a sequel to Battle Hymn, which was called The Midnight Hours. And that was with artist Ben Passmore, who in the past year or two has been nominated for an Eisner for his own work. And Ben and I did a short story with The Midnight Hour, and then we actually did a full, complete issue of what would have been the first issue of The Midnight Hours, which was set in 1950 and featured only the Midnight Hour from the original cast and a cast of new characters that he and I created. And to this day, I really like the potential of that book and enjoyed the first issue. I'd love to figure out what we could do from there, but Ben has sort of gone on to his own. He's doing his own thing and doing it quite well and successfully. So if we did do more with that, I'm not sure what his involvement would be. But it does exist. It has never been published. And I think what, at this point in time, what I think we may end up doing is taking the original Battle Hymn book, reworking some of the elements, some of the dialogue, some of the lettering, some of the color, and then maybe including all the supplemental stuff that hasn't really seen the light of day, including the original backup story by Greg Giordano and I that was not included in the trade, and the Ben Passmore stuff, and putting it together in sort of a deluxe anniversary edition of the book for anybody who might be interested in it. That's where we are now. We'll see if that happens. So there you go. Hopefully you kind of enjoyed this brief look at the origins of a particular comic book. As I said, it was a 5-issue miniseries. It was a finite story. At this point in time, I think the book is finally sold out at Diamond, so it's probably possible to get it from Amazon or what have you, and I think it's available on Comixology. But if things go right and we can get our ducks in a row, maybe you'll see more of Battle Hymn in the future. Thanks, guys. As always, subscribe, share, spread the word, and comment. Let me know what you'd like to hear about. This was kind of inspired by some people asking me to go over some of my older books. And in the future, I'll probably do some brief videos specifically discussing particular issues, how they came about, what the collaboration process was like, and really just anything that jogs the memory or springs to mind about the experience of creating those comics. So thanks again for tuning in, and I'll see you next time, guys.